If you value thoughtful, honest conversations about the Orthodox world, subscribe to my Substack, Orthodox Conundrum Commentary. You'll get frequent essays, episode notes, and occasional behind-the-scenes reflections that expand on what you hear on this podcast. It's free to join, and if you choose a paid plan, you directly support independent Jewish media and help keep me producing these conversations. Take 10 seconds right now to search for Orthodox Conundrum Commentary on Substack and hit subscribe, or click on the link in the description of this podcast. Thank you for being part of this community and helping us grow. Now, let's begin today's conversation with Rabbi Jeremy Wieder about the danger of false heroes.
I don't think any of us is in position to evaluate or to claim that he did no damage to the United States. You don't know, and I don't know, and most of his defenders don't know either. The government has made a claim. It wasn't just passing information to Israel that was helpful to Israel. If you read about at least what the government's claims were, it was much more severe than that. Again, I'm not in a position to evaluate that, but I don't think anybody's in a position to deny that. He betrayed his own country, and if he had done it and taken not a single penny from Israel, then we could have this argument of what I called Aveira Lishma. That would be one thing. But this was a person who was taking lots and lots of money and living a certain kind of lifestyle because of money, lots of money that was being paid to him by the Israeli government. And once you're paid as a spy, and I don't mean paying for your expenses, the extra expenses you would incur, it's very hard to say that this person is just a hero because he just acted so nobly.
I'm Scott Kahn, and this is the Orthodox Conundrum. This is the Orthodox Conundrum on JewishCoffeehouse.com. I'm Scott Kahn. There is a recurring pattern in parts of the Orthodox world, one that's always troubled me, but in recent years has become impossible to ignore. We take individuals who have committed serious wrongdoing, sometimes admitted it in court, sometimes even served jail time, and we nevertheless elevate them to the status of heroes, not necessarily despite their criminal behavior, but in some ways almost because of it. Just a couple of weeks ago, Mishpacha magazine ran a glowing feature calling Sholom Rubashkin the emunah and bitachon rebbe of the entire Jewish world, as though the only relevant fact of his story is his early release from prison. But as the record makes clear, including extensive evidence presented at trial, Rubashkin was involved in significant fraud, money laundering, and the exploitation of undocumented workers. Was his sentence excessive and unfair? Absolutely. Was there government overreach? No question. But that's not the same thing as innocence, and certainly not a basis for turning him into a moral authority. Let me be clear. Many of us have done things that we're not proud of, and that we wish we had done differently. The fact that Rubashkin went to jail is not the issue, so much as the fact that despite the real evidence, much of the Orthodox world treats him as if he were an innocent man who did nothing wrong, rather than an example of someone who was both perpetrator and victim. Now, if he had presented himself as an example of a Baal Tshuva, I'd have no complaint. I'd be fully pleased and fully supportive if we looked at him as someone who committed crimes, but has repented and is now living an honest life. That's good. If he acknowledged his conviction as just, and also complained about government overreach, he would be in the right. But that's not what's happening, and the consequences for the Orthodox self-image and behavior are serious. This is not just a Haredi phenomenon. In the modern Orthodox world, Jonathan Pollard has long been held up as a heroic defender of Israel. But as my guest, Rabbi Jeremy Wieder, points out in today's conversation, Pollard betrayed the country of which he was a citizen, took large sums of money for his actions, and passed along intelligence, the scope of which none of us fully know. The fact that the U.S. government mishandled his sentencing, which is terrible, does not magically transform espionage into idealism, particularly when you take money for it. So why do we as a community do this? Why does our community repeatedly turn criminals into role models, sometimes even into teachers of faith and morality? What psychological, sociological, and ideological needs are we trying to satisfy? And more importantly, what message are we sending our children when we confuse suffering with righteousness and denial with integrity? In today's episode, Rabbi Jeremy Wieder helps us unpack all of this. We discuss Rubashkin, Pollard, Aryeh Deri, the role of media and influencers, the dangers of denial and victimhood narratives, and the guardrails communities should adopt so that real role models, not the loudest or most dramatic or the most persecuted, become the people that we admire. It's a necessary conversation about integrity, responsibility, and choosing heroes who actually reflect Torah values. And we'll get to that conversation in just a minute. First, remember to subscribe to the Orthodox Conundrum podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Please rate it and write a review. Continue the conversation on Facebook by joining the Orthodox Conundrum discussion group. Finally, the best way to promote your organization, your business, or yourself is to create a high-quality podcast. And JCH Podcast Productions can help you make that happen. Whether you want to learn how to start your own podcast or want to improve the podcast you already produce, we will make it happen. Write to us at aliza@jewishcoffeehouse.com. That's ALIZA @jewishcoffeehouse.com. And let's get started with your high-quality, memorable, and effective podcast. Rabbi Jeremy Wieder is a Rosh Yeshiva at the Rabbi Isaac Elchanan Theological Seminary of Yeshiva University, where he occupies the Joseph and Gwendolyn Strauss Chair in Talmud. He holds a BA from Yeshiva College, a master's from the Bernard Revel Graduate School of Jewish Studies, and a PhD from New York University in Hebrew and Judaic Studies, and he was ordained at RIETS. He is the scholar in residence at Congregation Kilat Yeshurun in Manhattan, where he delivers the Dr. William Major Memorial Advanced Shiur in Talmud. He is passionate about meticulous Kriyat Torah and has published recordings of the entire Torah reading in both Havara Ashkenazit and Havara Sfaradit to assist people in improving their laning. Rabbi Wieder has joined me several times on this podcast, and it's always an honor to learn from him. Rabbi Jeremy Wieder, thank you for joining me today on the Orthodox Conundrum podcast.
Thank you very much for inviting me again.
The immediate impetus for this conversation is something that was in Mishpacha magazine from 2 weeks ago. I'm going to read a couple of sentences from the article I'm referencing. Quote, if you're an adult today, you surely remember the night at the end of Hanukkah 2017 when Rabbi Sholom Rubashkin was astoundingly released from prison after serving 8 years of a whopping 27-year sentence. But who would have imagined that 8 years after that personal miracle, he'd become the emunah and bitachon rebbe of the entire Jewish world? End quote. I'm now going to contrast that with a quote from the U.S. Attorney's Office of the Northern District of Iowa, which was written after his conviction. Evidence at trial showed Rubashkin inflated agri-processors, that's his company, sales, in order to fraudulently obtain millions of dollars in loans that were not backed by any collateral. Rubashkin also diverted millions of dollars in customer payments that were supposed to go to agri-processors' primary lender. He committed money laundering by running tens of millions of dollars through bank accounts at a Postville grocery store and a religious school. The trial evidence showed Rubashkin was personally involved in harboring hundreds of undocumented workers at agri-processors and illegally delaying payments to agri-processors' cattle suppliers. He paid for the purchase of fabricated IDs for undocumented workers and personally inspected those documents. Evidence showed Rubashkin's fraud resulted in over $26 million in actual loss to agri-processors' lenders. Now, from speaking to people who know about this case, Rabbi Wieder, it seems that his sentence was indeed unduly harsh. And as you and I spoke about just a moment ago before we started recording, this was a case of government overreach. Nevertheless, that's not the same thing as saying that he was innocent. Yet that is sort of the narrative that has developed, or at least, on some level, the question of his guilt and innocence is largely ignored. Now, we're not going to focus exclusively upon his story, but we are going to use it as a springboard to discuss a wider phenomenon that I found disturbing, namely the question of how various Orthodox communities choose their heroes and whether we're doing it correctly or incorrectly. So let me open up by asking you, what's the difference, in your opinion, between being inspired by someone's faith under pressure and calling them a hero? Or in different terms, what should be the standard for a hero in a Torah community?
I think that a hero is not a person who has engaged in crimes. It's a person who has resisted temptation to commit crimes. And people can put themselves in difficult situations. And because they get themselves out of those situations doesn't make them a hero. But I would say, maybe going a step further beyond the question, maybe you would want to go in this direction. I think that there's a challenge for every community. This is not a problem limited to the Orthodox community and not limited to the Jewish community. It is commonly found in many communities that have difficulty for one reason or another, coming to terms with the fact that somebody who, for whatever reason they have held up as some type of a standard bearer, is, to say the very least, complicated. And the fact, as you mentioned, that there was some serious government overreach here in terms of the sentencing doesn't mean that we should look the other way about the kinds of things that he did. I suspect, and I think that this probably is true in many communities, depending upon their belief system. And a belief system doesn't have to be a religious belief system. It can be a political belief system. There is a tendency to divide the world into two spheres, your sphere and everything else. And it's hard to acknowledge that somebody who's part of your sphere has done something wrong, because you perceive that somehow if they've done something wrong, that undermines the entire ideology. This is something that I think is not unique to the Haredi community. I think it is particularly an issue there because their self-perception is being separate from the rest of the world. If I were to contrast this a little bit with the modern Orthodox community, which, for better and worse, and it really cuts both ways, sees itself as very much part of the world around it. And there isn't this much of a need when someone does something wrong to see that as undermining your entire ideology, because you don't see yourself as starkly separated from the rest of the world. I think that in the Haredi community and any insular community or ideology, it becomes harder to divide between the two and to acknowledge that someone from your camp who's done something wrong and publicly been punished for it. It's very hard to acknowledge that. People like to live in denial, and it becomes much easier to do that in a case such as Rubashkin, where there was a problem. In other words, the government overreach makes it easy to portray him and yourself as a persecuted minority, even though that's not the reality here. I mean, that's a challenge. If I were to, introduce another example, take the case of Jonathan Pollard, who in many circles was regarded as a hero. And if one were to look at the record, it is far from clear that is the case. But the problem in Pollard's case was that the government breached an agreement that it had made with him, and his initial counsel was incompetent and failed to file what should have been an automatic appeal. And instead of receiving the sentence that the government had agreed to with him, instead the judge sentenced him to life or whatever it was. And so for those people whose I'll call Zionism in some sense is a central to their ideology, and anybody doing something to aid Israel's cause, as they perceive it, can't really be doing anything so bad. And especially if the government mistreated him, obviously he must be a hero and should be treated as such. Whereas the reality is he wasn't a hero. He betrayed his own country. He received a lot of money for doing so. It's not as if one could talk about this as being, purely what we would call an avera lishma. But he had an agreement with the government, and the government needs to honor that. And that was really the problem. So that's not an excuse for turning him into a hero. It's perfectly reasonable to fight for his cause when he was in jail, to say that the government has acted inappropriately.
And we're going to get back to Jonathan Pollard in a few moments. I first want to mention one other idea, which it sort of stands on the shoulders of what we've been saying until now. Part of the problem is that not only do we allow their public suffering to mitigate or obviate what they did wrong, but we then turn them into moral authorities. And on some level, I think that remains a problem as well. It's not just that we're saying that he got an unduly harsh sentence and thereby we ignore someone's guilt. We also start pretending that they're rebbeim of a certain sort from whom we can learn. And I don't mean learn about tshuva. I mean learn about morality.
I can't speak to the question of his morality or what they perceive it as. There is such a notion of celebrating about tshuva. Chazal certainly do so. They talk about people ona olamo b'sha'a achas. There is one caveat that has to go with that. The person has to confess their guilt. They have to be about tshuva. And one of the things that I think is challenging when you look at some of the press surrounding the Rubashkin case is the proclamation of innocence. Not merely that the government's sentencing or the judge's sentencing was disproportionate, totally absurd, but somehow that the entire conviction was he was being railroaded, pretending or looking the other way at some of the things that were rather serious. I think that he can serve, if you were to frame it as follows. He made a mistake, not a mistake, he did on purpose. He did something very wrong. He knew what he did was wrong. He acknowledges that what he did was wrong, but he has been unjustly punished. And he could be stuck for many, many, many more years in prison. And he had bitachon, and eventually his bitachon was answered. So, yeah, you could. I'm not sure that's the first thing I'd be running to do. I'd rather find somebody who was innocent and was convicted and had bitachon. But okay, so if he acknowledged that he did something wrong, but he was unfairly sentenced, and he had bitachon, so yeah, that would be. Again, it's not the first person I would run to hold up as a hero, but at least I could make an argument. But until a person does tshuva, and the first part is being acknowledging what the chet was. Central to it is vidui, so it's hard to see such a person as a hero.
Yeah, and let me echo what you just said. If any of the people we mentioned are being touted as paragons of tshuva, I would have no quarrel. I would welcome it, in fact. And I don't think that someone who's done something wrong should be ostracized. In fact, if that person publicly recants and said, I made a mistake, that's admirable. And in fact, if that person wanted to be a rebbe of tshuva, of repentance, that's a good thing. I wouldn't have any problem whatsoever. But as you said, the problem is, first of all, are they necessarily the first person we should look at as examples of bitachon, of trust in God? And second of all, and maybe more to the point, they are denying, at least some of the people we're talking about, deny wrongdoing altogether and essentially imply that they were falsely declared guilty. And the whole thing was, I guess, akin to some of the Hasidic rebbes who were put into jail on false charges a couple hundred years ago in Russia. Right. And that's not what happened here.
I should add also, I'm not going to claim to be the expert in studying these issues, but one of the common denominators among a number of these cases, including one that you didn't mention, but I think his name is Nehemiah Weberman. This was very much recently in the news. The common denominator, in my sense, is that part of the reason that the sentencing was the way it was had to do with the attitudes of the defendants themselves, the lack of expression of remorse. And that doesn't justify breaching a plea agreement. It doesn't justify excessive sentencing. I mean, you might see that as a piece of it, but really it seems to me the core of sentencing is supposed to be based upon the nature and the severity of the crime and how it's typically sentenced. But I think that in all of these cases, I think with the wrong reaction, either the government or the judge, but what provoked some of this was the refusal to acknowledge any type of culpability or responsibility. Again, I don't think that should have changed a single thing when it came to Pollard's sentence or even to Rubashkin's sentence. But in terms of the question of are they now suitable to be heroes, so there can't be azivas hachet until you acknowledge that there was a chet.
I do think, however, that Rubashkin did express a type of remorse before his sentencing. He didn't proclaim guilt, but he didn't say I did nothing wrong and stand there defiantly. He did acknowledge some guilt. That's what's in some ways ironic or paradoxical about the whole case, which is that now people who defend him, and I saw on the Facebook page associated with this podcast, some people saying, no, he didn't do anything wrong. And when confronted with the fact that he acknowledged at his sentencing or at some point during the trial that he did something wrong, even if it wasn't acknowledged as a crime per se, they say, well, a lot of people will say that they're guilty just to lower the sentencing. So I just want to make sure it's clear that Rubashkin did express some remorse.
Not to the extent of his guilt.
Okay. When a community embraces this story about being railroaded, as you put it, that the whole thing was a sham rather than an overreach by the government or the prosecution, maybe you're not the right person, Rabbi Wieder, to answer this, but I'm curious what you think. Why does this seem to take place repeatedly? What's the psychological need that people have in order to say he actually did nothing wrong whatsoever, when all evidence is to the contrary?
That, I think, goes back to what I suggested earlier, which is the question of I'll call team psychology. I think it requires two things. You first have to see yourself as part of a group, as part of a minority group, and to some extent an outsider, although not always. And you also have to, I think, not be able to see the world in its complexity and human beings in their complexity. People who are good people sometimes make mistakes. not all people are either perfectly good or perfectly bad. But if you perceive yourself as an outsider, it's hard to have somebody on your team if they muddy the picture. So unless you're going to cast them out and really deny that they're one of you, so it becomes hard, I think, to accept that they're one of you and yet they've done things that are wrong. Because being an adherent to your ideology doesn't mean that everybody who adheres to your ideology is going to be perfect. I think it's important to stress this is, there are other examples of this and that don't necessarily involve criminality, but inappropriate behavior. And it really cuts across the entire spectrum. There was an incident, I'm not going to talk about names, some of it's theoretically public, in Jaffa, where there were some serious complaints against a prominent and influential member of the organization that were ignored for a long time. And they were, again, ignored, I think, because you're part of an ideology. And again, I don't think this is the only factor, but it is undermining to your team when you have to acknowledge that some of the things that you ostensibly stand for are central to your even mission are being ignored within your own organizations. So I just want to be clear. I don't think it doesn't always have to involve criminality, and it's not only the Haredi world or the right-wing world of it, and it's not only the Jewish world. This is everywhere.
Let me just explain to our listeners, JOFA is the Jewish Orthodox Feminist Alliance, for those who didn't know. That also gets, Rabbi Wieder, to the problem that institutions, almost by definition, defend themselves. Their self-preservation becomes often the primary cause more than the cause they're supposedly trying to represent.
We've seen this over and over, and it's not limited, again, to our community. You can point to the NCSY scandal, but you can point to the Boy Scouts. You can point to numerous churches in the United States who've had similar scandals. You can look at the Catholic Church. I mean, probably on a scale that outstrips everything else. One went on for decades there, and that which we know of. So you're correct. You have a movement that sees the movement and its organizations as greater than, as more important sometimes than doing the right thing. At some point, your ideology becomes more important, and your organization becomes more important than making sure that what you're doing is right.
I'd like to move on to another aspect of what we're talking about, which is that when we talk about this railroading, this idea of someone claiming I did nothing wrong, and people in the community accepting it, I asked about the psychological need that's being met, but there's another problem too, which is that on some level, I wonder if we are unintentionally, perhaps, normalizing unethical behavior, particularly if it's directed towards the government, but not necessarily only then. If people who are convicted criminals are then lauded and their criminality is essentially ignored and they're treated as heroes, what are we saying to members of our community about the rightness or wrongness of unethical behavior?
I'm not sure that is the issue in this case. If the people who are celebrating him, in the case of Rubashkin, it doesn't really matter who it is, are doing so under the guise of, well, he's innocent. So that's not, I think, normalizing unethical behavior. It's a claim that there was no unethical behavior here. So for people who are, I think the people who will readily acknowledge that someone engaged in unethical behavior, so that firstly, they look askance at the entire enterprise of what's being done. I don't think it normalizes it for them. I think where you have a much bigger issue with that, and this is not a new issue, is when people have engaged in financial dishonesty and have become philanthropists. And the community, many communities, in fact, it's, as I'll talk about Kesef being Mitaher Mamzerim. So here, people who will engage in financial dishonesty and then give large donations to whatever particular organization, somehow their crimes are overlooked. That sends the wrong message. That creates cynicism. But I think here, assuming that the people who are proclaiming his innocence have genuinely fooled themselves into doing so, I don't know that normalizes this behavior.
Okay, that's fair enough. I guess I'm wondering if people are truly believing what they're saying or if they're more sweeping it under the rug because he had suffered so much. But I understand what you mean by that. let me ask you, do you think that we're inadvertently teaching a very dangerous lesson, that the best religious posture when you're caught is a combination of denial and victimhood? Combining those together takes you out of the realm of being a criminal and can actually turn you into a hero.
I find it hard to believe that the calculations that people in this situation make are based upon that they'll become a hero to the community. I think that I would guess. Thank God I've never been in that situation. Hopefully, never be in that situation. But when one is in that situation, I imagine your primary thought process is, how do I most likely minimize my punishment? Which is, I think, a very reasonable approach to it. The situations are complex and people may have other considerations, but I wouldn't think that someone is going to choose a path with the primary thinking of that, I'll deny this and I'll become a hero. I think lots and lots of people who are accused of crimes, and many of whom might really be guilty, denial is one way of dealing with it, hoping to escape punishment. But at a certain point, sometimes admission is the best way of doing it, and taking a plea deal or something like that. But I find it, perhaps I'm insufficiently cynical, but I find it hard to believe that their thought process what this does is encourage people to, at the outset, to adopt the posture of denial.
Speaking about admission of guilt, you mentioned before that true repentance, tshuva, requires that. In cases of public wrongdoing, what do you think we should do with those people who are, quote unquote, balei tshuva, for people who acknowledge their wrongdoing? The guy who stole money, has his name on the building, gets put in jail and acknowledges he was wrong. Do we take his name off the building? What exactly do we have to do? Should he no longer be allowed to have any leadership positions? What exactly is necessary? Because we do believe in the power of tshuva, even though I will add, that doesn't necessarily mean the community has to completely go along with it. Meaning, between him and God, that's one thing. The community can, quote unquote, forgive him. It doesn't have to necessarily put him back where he was. What's your feeling in general about someone who does public wrongdoing, particularly if it involves criminality, and when the person does tshuva publicly, what we should do about that person afterwards, how we should treat him?
I think that this is a really, really complicated issue. If I were to just point to, starting out to respond to the question, two very opposite approaches. I mean, they're opposite approaches to somewhat different issues. So a Kohen who was mishamish b'beis chonyo in an what question was an idolatrous temple or not, it may not matter, can no longer be mishamish in the Beis HaMikdash, right? He has forfeited his ability to function as a Kohen in that context. Although, to the best of my knowledge, he's still capable of duchening, and so much so, not in that case, because I don't think he's disqualified from duchening, but when it comes to a Kohen, shahar gas hanefesh, a Kohen who kills, even accidentally, where he theoretically, a Kohen who kills is disqualified from duchening because his hands are filled with blood, you will find, tshuvos of various kinds of, in the Rishonim, Narami in particular. I think actually, as I think about it, was about a Kohen who had become a meshuma and wanted to do tshuva, who maybe should have been disqualified, but he bends over backwards because of takanas hashavim, the desire to encourage people to do tshuva, to make the process easier. So just in this particular example, you have really opposite tensions, opposite positions. And I think that the starting point in any discussion, again, there's much more, I'm sure, to be said about this. I haven't, thought out every aspect, formal presentation, but your comment about if someone has confessed to financial crimes, their name has to come off the building. Put that name on there, it's basically saying, but you're rewarded every for financial crimes. I think a second consideration, which may apply broadly, but it tends to apply to particular situations of abuse and sexual abuse, is for order for it even consider a person being restored to any type of position, there has to be a fair degree of confidence the person won't reoffend. In other words, a person could have done terrible things, committed heinous acts of abuse. They can do tshuva. I mean, to what extent they can do so, but clearly you're not going to put that person in the classroom again. And, certainly if you can't be sure, and we often can't, that you won't experience recidivism. The question of how you relate to them otherwise, so that I think is different. I think a person should be able to do tshuva, and They shouldn't be ostracized from the community if they've expressed remorse, if they've apologized to the victims, if they've made restitution to the extent that it's possible. I don't think they should be thrown out of the community if they're not a danger to reoffend or not put in a position to reoffend. I think that there's I don't want to call it cancel culture, but sometimes there's a kind of vengeance, often not even the victims. Sometimes it's the victims, but sometimes, people who have a very strong streak of righteousness of punishing such people, even when they're not a threat. Again, we're not talking about necessarily giving them after Yonah, but I do think that there has to be an opportunity for people to do tshuva. What's very challenging is that many of the questions I think you could state this explicitly, but the particular issues that come up are people who were in communal positions, particularly in positions of rabbanus or teaching. And there's aside from the concern of the danger of a person reoffending, even if for the moment that there's not, there is a concern of kisif seicho and yushmu das sorry pihu, that in order to have someone as a role model, they have to be imdom harav l'malach Hashem tzvakos. If the rebbe is comparable to an angel of God, so then lamod heimenu, and if not, perosh heimenu, and then it's not. If he is, then it's appropriate to learn from him. If it's not, he cannot be the role model teaching. So there are some positions in particular where someone who has committed certain kinds of offenses can't return to their position because of the very specific nature of that position. But I think that it's I think this is a very complicated issue. Just sort of scratching the surface in that response.
Okay, let me scratch the surface in the other direction, though. You just mentioned if a person accepts accountability and avoiding cancel culture. What about when a person does not take any responsibility for something? Should we actively refuse on, or should that person not get an aliyah in our shuls? Again, realizing this is a very big issue and we're only scratching the surface.
Well, I think this. I think it's complicated. It depends on what the offense was. I would say it depends partially upon, sadly, I'm going to say this, whether it tramples upon communal norms or abused communal trust. So I'm sorry to have to say this, even though I would take a hard line, but a person who would commit financial crimes, but not against the community, I certainly would be giving them honors, but would I expel them from the community or ostracize them or refuse to give them an aliyah that I might give to a Machal Shabbos or an Ochel Nevelos and Shreifos? I don't know if I would go that far. Truth is, even if they did tshuva, I don't know if I would give them after Yonah. But I think that certain things so much, if someone, it's a complicated category. Let's say someone were a Moser. I don't mean someone who reports another Jew who's supposed to go to jail, should go to jail. That's not Mesira. But supposing someone really does something against the community, gets other parties involved, gets a government involved and creating a mess in a community when it shouldn't have happened, that person has sinned against the community. That's the kind of person I might see that we would ostracize. But I think for a lot of garden variety stuff, and I don't mean when I say garden variety, I don't mean to minimize its severity. I take financial crimes especially pretty seriously. I don't know it means that even if the person hasn't expressed remorse, I'm not sure you would completely ostracize them from the community. Every situation requires, I think, weighing with a degree of seichel.
I appreciate your saying what you said, even though I realize that we could go into depth and people can say this or that or quibble on any given point. This is obviously just the surface. One more question, or really more of a statement about that, which I believe you and I probably addressed in an earlier podcast, but I think it's important to mention that I have heard the distinction mentioned between a crime which is victimless or a crime which is not victimless. And at least as I see it, I think we have to get rid of that distinction when it comes to financial crimes. Ethical lapses or crimes when it comes to finances, I don't think there's such a thing as a victimless crime. I think that distinction is spurious. Do you agree with me?
I agree with you. I think almost by definition, a financial crime is not victimless. If it's even when a person steals from the government, in the immediate specific act, it's hard to identify the victim, but it victimizes society. When people cheat on taxes, it means that governments charge higher tax rates across the population. It means every one of us who pays our taxes honestly ends up paying more. It's not a victimless crime.
Okay, now you mentioned earlier Jonathan Pollard, and I'm guessing that Some of my listeners who might have felt very comfortable criticizing Rubashkin will be taken aback hearing his name also in the same conversation. So I'd like to ask you why you put him in the same category, because a lot of people would say it's fundamentally different. Rubashkin, according to what we understand, laundered money or committed fraud for the sake of his own personal gain or his company's gain, whereas Jonathan Pollard was assisting the state of Israel, and he's a Jewish person. So you already said the beginning of this, but I'd like you to express it explicitly. Why is Jonathan Pollard not a hero?
So let me start with a basic premise. I don't think any of us is in position to evaluate or to claim that he did no damage to the United States. You don't know, and I don't know, and most of his defenders don't know either. The government has made a claim. It wasn't just passing information to Israel that was helpful to Israel. If you read about at least what the government's claims were, it was much more severe than that. Again, I'm not in a position to evaluate that, but I don't think anybody's in a position to deny that. He betrayed his own country, and if he had done it and taken not a single penny from Israel, then we could have this argument of what I called Aveira Lishma, that he did something which was he transgressed, but he did it with the purest of motivations, the purest intentions, because he calculated that this was better for the world, even for the Jewish people. That would be one thing. But this was a person who was taking lots and lots of money and living a certain kind of lifestyle because of money, lots of money that was being paid to him by the Israeli government. From what I understand, Israel initially denied this. Only, I think in 1998, did they acknowledge that they had paid him. And once you're paid as a spy, and I don't mean paying for your expenses, the extra expenses you would incur, it's very hard to say that this person is just a hero because he just acted so nobly. Now, and again, neither I nor any of the listeners are in a position to contest, and I'm not telling you that it's necessarily right, but to contest what the claims of the United States government are. He wasn't just passing information that Israel used to protect himself. The claim is that he passed along huge amounts of information of how we collect our intelligence. He had unusual access to classified information. Again, according to the government, I can't evaluate that. And if that is the case, I understand why this was a serious betrayal of the United States. So if your position is, someone could say to me, well, I think if it's a choice between Israel and the United States, and you're a citizen of the United States and not of Israel, put that question aside of dual citizenship, then you should betray the United States in order to help Israel. That's a position that I hear, but then you kind of can't complain when people accuse Jews of dual loyalty. Right? That actually accusation becomes true. If you had someone, and again, I can't evaluate the facts because none of us have access to this information. I would put it this way. If your claim was, this was an ally of the United States citizen, but this is an ally of the United States, that I believe that the United States is immorally and unjustly withholding information for their own protection, and I will do it, and I will do it as a noble cause for no compensation. That's a tricky argument, but I would also add that you should adopt the same position with our other allies, not just the state of Israel. You know, if Britain or Canada were in need that you perceived information was being withheld from them that unjustly, again, you have to make, that's quite a calculation to take upon yourself, but if that's what you feel and you will do it for the Shema, that's a complicated question. But I think that people who are defending him are not acknowledging what the claims of the United States government are and not acknowledging that he was not doing this purely altruistically at a minimum. And I stated very clearly earlier that the United States government misbehaved terribly. This is a larger, I'll call, question of justice when you have the government. This is not just true with Pollard. You mentioned earlier, people will sometimes say things that, in the course once they're convicted in order to lessen their punishment. And some people will say that maybe they don't mean it. But there is a really challenging part of the justice system when the government pushes people to take plea deals, and they use enormous leverage against them, and they basically threaten to charge them with 6 times the number of crimes unless they acknowledge their guilt, and they'll get a lesser sentence. And most people don't have the resources to match the government's resources, and sometimes people do take plea deals because the alternative, the possibility of going to trial and losing, could be 70 years in prison, as opposed to I'll admit guilt and I'll take 5 years in prison. So that piece, that is a very important larger question of the power of government and the ability to abuse it. In the case of Pollard, the government abused its power unbelievably. There's no question that he was a victim of injustice, not because he didn't commit a crime and not because perhaps he didn't commit a really serious crime. And I'm not going to compare his, I don't know, none of us know enough exactly about what he gave to Israel and where that wound up compared to people will often invoke a case from a long time ago, the Walkers. I don't know how much, and I know they spied for Russia. I'm not in a position to evaluate how serious his crime was, but it's pretty darn obvious that the government abused its power in sentencing him to the kind of sentence that they gave him after they had agreed. They had an agreement and they violated the agreement. And that's the big, injustice here. That's the thing that everybody should have been fighting about. Not whether you think he was guilty or not, or, how severe was his spying and it was the right thing to do, not the right thing to do. It's the abuse of power by the government that he was a victim of.
Part of the problem, though, as you've indicated, is that even if, and I'll say when, I think it's quite clear, even if someone does a crime, commits a crime, the fact that there was prosecutorial overreach and in the end the sentencing was way out of proportion with what was promised to him, and therefore the government completely misbehaved, the hard line to draw is at what point does that whitewash what he did? In other words, let's say that he should have received, I'm making this up, 15 years in prison. And in the end, he ended up spending 25 or 30 years in prison, and then he's released. Does that mean we should treat him as a hero because he was released way too late? And on some level, his punishment was a kapara for all that he did? Or do we have to look at it more nuanced than that?
I would just say he should be regarded as a hero. I think that at the time, there were people, pretty certain, who were reluctant to fight for him because they were concerned about accusations of dual loyalty. And there was clearly an enormous degree of animus from the intelligence community towards him. And it could be for good reason, but that's totally irrelevant here. There's only one, I believe that in his case, there was one factor that was relevant, which is the government breached disagreement. His lawyer was incompetent, and there are technicalities, but this was an absolute avla. And everybody should have said that. You can utter in the same sentence that he was guilty of a crime, it was an inexcusable crime, and his punishment is unjust. And even if the punishment, even if some people in the same situation might have gotten a life sentence or much worse, but there was an agreement by the government for him to plead guilty, he would accept that and accept the sentence. So that's outrageous. It doesn't. So I don't think that makes him a hero. It does make him, in a strange sense, it makes him into a victim. But I don't think, victims are automatically heroes.
Right. We haven't even spoken about someone here in Israel who is another example of the same. I'm speaking of Aryeh Deri, the head of the Shas party, who in 2000 was convicted of bribery. He served 22 months in prison. Later on, again became the head of the Shas party. And then in 2022, he made a plea deal where he again admitted 2 crimes and was given a year suspended sentence. Soon after that, he gave a speech where he said the prosecution was motivated by his heritage, being a Sephardi, rather than the truth. And he right now effectively is the head of Shas, and that hasn't changed. Here we have another situation where it's not a matter of the media alone lionizing somebody, but a political party itself in the halls of power allowing its leader, its very strong leader, to be someone who has been convicted multiple times. And of course, the first time that he was convicted, he came out with a whole video that said, "I accuse," basically echoing Dreyfus. And unless we just believe that the Supreme Court and the courts in Israel are completely out to get him, I have a hard time believing that. It's another example of the same sort of phenomenon where we're allowing back into the halls of power an unrepentant criminal who repeatedly has even admitted guilt in court and then ignores the consequences of that when he can do it because he can somehow get away with it. And this time, I guess we have ourselves to blame because the voting public has allowed it.
And in a strange way, politicians, it bothers me less. It's not that the crimes bother me less. It's not that I don't scratch my head. But at least this is not about heroes. Politics is transactional. And most people don't care about the character of the people they elect. They care what they can deliver. And while I think that I don't generally buy into that, I certainly don't wholly buy into that, there certainly have been politicians whose private lives, and I understand part of the problem with Vida, it wasn't his private life, has not, has certainly been, their private lives have been less than sterling, to put it mildly, but they've been very effective in governing. They've been very, very effective for producing things. So I don't particularly like that, but I understand the position that says that some character aspects are just not important. That's already a little bit of a slippery slope in the sense of where exactly do you draw the line. Now, if you ask me, someone who abuses the public trust, who has stolen money from the government, from the public, and I don't remember the specifics of Aryeh Deri, the crimes in which he was convicted, but at the very least, the voters are deciding who they think is going to represent their interests. And by the way, there also it's that wasn't the question. Again, I don't know the specifics of so much of government overreach, but I think that the natural reaction of many in the Sephardi community, and I understand why, given the historic enormous amounts of discrimination and still ongoing against Sephardim, despite all the heights of power that they reached and so on, but the racism against Sephardim that existed for so long, maybe it's a little better now, has created an image in that community that people are out to get them. And I'm not going to defend Deri. I find it repulsive that he's put back in power. But I do understand why the voters feel the way they do, because they lived lives suffering from discrimination, racism. So it's very easy to believe them that a justice system dominated by Ashkenazim has convicted this, Sephardi political hero. It's not hard to understand why people buy into that narrative.
That's true, but I will disagree slightly with what you said about politicians, even though I agree with your read of what politicians are supposed to do for us. In a country like Israel, where these politicians are ostensibly representing parties based on Torah values and are there representing the religious public, not in a secular party as a religious politician, but as a representative of a Torah value, of the Shas party, of Gimel, or whichever party anyone is a member of, I feel that by being part of that party, whether they like it or not, they're holding themselves to a higher standard, and we can't simply say, oh, they're politicians. I say, yeah, if you're a politician, you're going to mess around, then don't be in a Torah party, because you're actually bringing Torah down into the mud with you.
Well, I would, and here I betray my strong American tendencies. I would argue here that religious parties shouldn't exist. I don't mean as a matter of law, but I think that religion and politics are like oil and water. They don't mix very well. But if you start with the premise that these religious parties are really ethnic parties, they're not religious parties. The ethnicity in this case might be appealing to Sephardim, but in some cases the ethnicity that people might be appealing to is a religion. But if you start with the assumption, as I do, that these aren't really religious parties and they don't really stand for religious values, they stand for only their community's interests, then I'm not defending him. Do I think it's terrible? Yes, I do. But the world of politics is a really dirty place. And so it bothers me less than when it's in institutions whose whole purpose is religious, whether it's a shul, whether it's a school, whether it's a Jewish communal organization especially of a religious nature. That bothers me much more than in the context of politics. Would I vote for such a person? No. But if you ask me, would I encourage people to vote for such a person? Well, the answer is I don't tell people how to vote. But I find it to be particularly loathsome when you have individuals like that. But
we're on the same page, because when it comes to religious parties, I've been very vocal about my distaste for the whole concept. And while I believe that there should be religious politicians, the idea of a religious party, a Torah party, I think is, if not quite an oxymoron, a very, very bad idea, minimally spoken. Let me ask you about the role that from media and influencers play in laundering reputations, because I opened up our conversation by quoting a line from Mishpacha magazine. And the question is, beyond the fact that it sends the wrong message, do we have a responsibility to call out those magazines as well? Because I've been emphasizing our problem with the person and the hero worship associated with it. Is there something we should be doing to our influencers or our podcast hosts or our magazines or our newspapers, and trying to do whatever we can? Admittedly, they have their own profit motive, but doing what we can to say this is not acceptable.
I mean, I guess my question to you would be, what can you do? The whole, you use the term, I hate the term, not because I hate its existence, the idea of an influencer. Anybody who understands the world of influencing, understands that it's mostly about selling stuff, and everything else is mostly peripheral. It's influencers mostly don't believe in anything other than selling whatever they're selling. They're not interested in truth. They're not interested in the complexity of the world. There are very few that are like that, occasionally. But they're going to do what they do exactly. But you said in most cases, it's the profit motive. I think in a case like Mishpacha magazine, I don't think it's a profit motive. I think it functions, and I'm not a regular reader of it, but it functions as I don't want to use the term mouthpiece, but it functions as a news organ for a certain part of the community, and part of its job, and a large part of its job, is to cheerlead. And I want to suggest there's some very important things that they write about, some very important things, but some of it's also cheerleading for the community. So I don't think do I think they should have written this? Of course not, but I'm not sure how any of us are going to influence those choices.
I guess the only thing I could say is that people decide we're no longer going to buy your magazine or listen to your podcast or do whatever it is that would allow them to continue doing it, thinking that everybody's behind them.
But I'm willing to bet that the people listening to your podcast, a relatively small fraction, are Mishpacha subscribers. Some, but you correct me if I'm wrong. But my guess would be that the audience that is naturally going to be sympathetic to this perspective is, I'm not saying it's exclusively not, and Mishpacha magazine is actually, they do have some very interesting things. I suspect it's not the primary subscriber base. So you're right. Anybody listening could say, I'm dropping my Mishpacha magazine subscription, but I don't think that's going to be so many.
Unfortunately, my audience isn't so broad that I can say that it'll have a tremendous effect. But I suppose those who feel differently have the right to do what we're talking about now. Rabbi Wieder, as we conclude, let me ask you about practical guardrails that we can make our conversation stay useful. And instead of simply talking about a problem, which itself I think has utility, we also have to try and talk about what groups, organizations, schools, and podcasts should do. In practice, how do we teach people nuance without normalizing wrongdoing? Is there something that we should all do in our various organizations as a practical matter, as a matter of communal policy, perhaps, that might move this in a very positive direction?
Well, I think you highlighted the problem. Problem is nuance, is complexity. If people saw the world in its complexity, there would be less of a danger of people doing this. In other words, it's possible to see that Rubashkin was mistreated by the justice system without having to regard him as a hero or without having to pretend that he didn't do anything wrong. Right? It's possible to recognize that whatever Pollard did, and however you evaluate that, he was mistreated by the justice system. It doesn't make him a hero, but we, by all means, should stand up to protect, and people should have stood up to try to protect them from the injustices of what the government did. I think other cases as well. Every scandal, people have to be willing to recognize that ideas may be wonderful, and certainly from our vantage point, the Torah may be perfect, but we are not perfect. And the people whose job is to educate, whose job is to implement those values, are not perfect people. And acknowledging that there are people who shouldn't have been in those positions, people who made mistakes, doesn't invalidate the ideology. The cover-up is worse, in some ways, is worse than the crime. If we can't acknowledge that we're capable of making mistakes, and that doesn't invalidate what we stand for, that's the starting point. That's where the problem begins.
Let me ask one final question. At the beginning, you mentioned that our heroes should be the people who didn't give in to temptation. Of course, we don't know who those people are. My question to you, Rabbi Wieder, is how do we determine and how can we find people who are publicly heroes? I'll give you my own example. I have on my bookshelf behind me a number of books. I call it the heroes bookshelf, with certain rebbeim who exemplify the values that I want to inculcate in myself and my children, halavai. And I'm just wondering if you have a general way of our discovering heroes, because too often it feels that, as we're talking about today, publicly, those who are lionized are not heroes. Publicly, those who get the most publicity are not heroes, and sometimes we treat them as such. And the people who should be our heroes often are relegated to the background or ignored altogether. How would you tell people in a way that's practical to choose their heroes?
That's an easy question. Look, one thing I should emphasize at the outset. I think we should generally give people the benefit of the doubt. And what I mean by that is that if you have a person who has a positive public reputation, a person who's a publicly visible and as best as you can tell behaves appropriately, I think those are the first people that you want to hold up as heroes, with the recognition that sometimes heroes have clay feet and sometimes we make mistakes in those we hold up as heroes. We don't know, who was the Yosef HaTzadik who was tempted by Ashes Potiphar and withstood the temptation. Obviously, we like to believe that most of our heroes don't have to endure that. But one thing I think that, and again, just because somebody hasn't experienced this or we haven't seen it does not mean that they shouldn't be, I don't like the term hero, I'll use the term role model. But, if I were to think of one of my favorite role models, he's been dead a long time, is Akavia ben Mahalalo. And Akavia ben Mahalalo, the videos tells us, had 4 opinions that he differed with the Chachamim. And they told him that he should retract his opinions. And if they did, they would make him to an Av based in Yisrael. And he responded and said that, I hope I quote this right, that mutav li kara rush shota kol yamai, I'd rather be called an idiot all my life, rather to be for one moment wicked in God's eyes. You can sometimes see, you can't always see, people who act with tremendous integrity, who are committed to principles, and their principles aren't for sale. And sometimes I see people like this who I don't agree with in their principles. I may strongly disagree with them, but I understand that I see the world differently, and they are steadfastly dedicated and willing to stand by their principles, even when it comes at a cost to them. If you want to talk about what is heroism, that's heroism. I don't think we need so many heroes. I think it's okay to look at people who do so much for the community, be they rabbinic or be lay leadership, who don't have a shmua ra associated with them, and these are the people that we can look up to. And I don't think, it's unfortunate that we wind up with, when you talk about these heroes, there are plenty of figures, rabbinical figures, non-rabbinical figures in the Haredi community, in our community, in many communities, who are worthy of admiring and emulating. And they don't have to, have served jail or been unjustly persecuted, and even if they were unjustly, persecuted, completely. That's not what needs to be in a hero.
Okay, well, Rabbi Wieder, this has been very inspiring, as it always is when I speak to you, and I'm very grateful that you took your time to speak with us today. I appreciate it.
Very good. Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
Before we sign off, a brief word of thanks. Several new listeners have joined our Patreon, and I'm genuinely grateful. You're not buying bonus episodes. You're underwriting the work, the research, editing, and the independence that lets us ask hard questions with respect and clarity. If today's conversation helped you think more carefully about Torah, community, and the world we inhabit, please consider becoming a patron. Even a small monthly contribution makes a real difference in keeping the Orthodox Conundrum going and accessible to everyone. The link is in the show notes. To those who have already joined, thank you. Your vote of confidence means more than you know. And to everyone else, I hope you'll consider joining us. Subscribe to the Orthodox Conundrum podcast wherever you get your podcasts, and please rate it and write a review. I'd appreciate it if you go to Apple Podcasts and rate and review the Orthodox Conundrum. It takes literally 2 minutes. It's just giving a certain number of stars and writing 1 or 2 sentences. Please like the Orthodox Conundrum podcast on Facebook and join our growing Facebook group, the Orthodox Conundrum Discussion Group, where you can feel free to discuss issues in Orthodoxy in an honest and friendly environment. Subscribe to my Substack, Orthodox Conundrum Commentary. Check out the link in the description of this podcast to get your free subscription today. Finally, do you have a message that needs to get out? Do you want to promote your business, your organization, or your cause? The best way is by producing a podcast, and Jewish Coffee House can make it happen. I have experience producing hundreds of podcasts, both for myself and for satisfied clients. Whether you want to learn everything you need in one day, or relax and record and let me do the heavy lifting, Jewish Coffee House Productions will work with you to make it happen and make it even better than you imagined. Let me help you today. Write to us at aliza@jewishcoffeehouse.com. That's ALIZA @jewishcoffeehouse.com. And let's get started with your high-quality, memorable, and effective podcast. I'm Scott Kahn. This has been the Orthodox Conundrum on jewishcoffeehouse.com.